was very, very interesting. Now we're going to move on, and now Dr. Barnett Rubin is going to speak. He's the senior fellow at the, or who was at the head of the, and the head of the Afghan-Pakistan regional program at the Center on International Cooperation at NYU in New York, director of the Center for Preventive Action and Director, Peace and Conflict Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for the Study of Central Asia at Columbia University. Dr. Rubin.
Well, thank you. I'll just make a few kind of basic remarks. And these are my interim conclusions about the situation. And I might summarize it by saying that my conclusion from this is that the only policy that is really in the interest of the United States and the West is one that is completely unacceptable to us. So I don't know what we are going to do. But first of all, the Taliban are the government of Afghanistan. They are the only political force that has controlled all of Afghanistan since 1978. It is true that it's a small minority of people in Afghanistan that support their ideology. But I think that the fact that we live in developed societies where leaders are chosen on the basis of elections has led us to exaggerate the importance of ideological or cognitive agreement in politics. Because the fact that the Taliban have effective control of the territory and population is a great argument for their legitimacy for many people in Afghanistan, simply because the alternative is not a political force that they agree with. The alternative is no one being in control, okay? And they have had experience of that. As far as I can tell, the elites of the previous regime are pretty much, with a few exceptions, completely discredited and have no means of leading opposition to the Taliban. It is certainly notable that besides being the government that controls the territory and population, the Taliban are the only political movement in Afghanistan that has a national presence. Now, their presence is uneven, but there is no political party or movement that has that kind of national presence. And I attribute that to the fact that for the past 20 years, the way to mobilize resources was by pleasing the Americans and the Europeans, not by mobilizing the population of Afghanistan. And consequently, there is an ideological legacy of the Islamic Republic. There is an educational, social legacy, public services, but there's very little in the way of political legacy. None of the presidents of the country formed political parties to mobilize people. So now, however, the opposition that is emerging is the Islamic State. And let me provide you with a hypothesis about why that is the case. During the period of the Islamic Republic, there was, for various reasons, a political space for armed resistance to the government and to the foreigners. And that space was occupied by the Taliban, who, as Adam Bachko said, are a very coherent organization, though they do have serious disputes between their Defense Department and their State Department, which happens in other organizations as well. And they have rivalries for who gets jobs, which sometimes are structured along tribal or ethnic lines, which is not unknown in more developed countries either. But they monopolize that political space, and the Islamic State had great difficulty in breaking into that political space. Now that political space is wide open. And the only organization inside Afghanistan that seems to be vying for capturing a huge constituency, which is there for armed struggle against the Taliban, is the Islamic State. And we see, furthermore, that the Islamic State, unlike the Taliban, is primarily now it didn't originate this way. The Islamic State today is very different from what it was 5-10 years ago. It is now a primarily urban organization recruiting relatively educated people. It's not recruiting Fulbright scholars, but it's recruiting people from Kabul University and Nangarhar University, and has effective underground terrorist networks. And the most striking phenomenon since the Taliban takeover has been the Islamic State's success in recruiting Tajiks. I have from multiple sources, including Tajik sources, that Tajik youth, I don't mean it's not a mass movement, but who didn't join the Islamic State before are now joining the Islamic State. Of course, there was a demonstration in front of the Tour Eiffel, I don't know, I'm sure you know about it, but by some supporters of Massoud, where they didn't actually support the Islamic State. Their remarks were mistranslated, but they said that because of the exclusionary ethnic politics of the Taliban, Tajik and the corruption and incapacity of the old leaders of the Tajiks will go to the Islamic State, to Khorasan. And we see that happening. Now, of course, the Taliban have resources, the Islamic State is not that popular, etc. But let me point out something else. There is now something going on in Afghanistan that we have never seen before and don't understand. I don't understand it either. And that is that we are now seeing the state in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not a failed state now, any more than it was under the Islamic Republic. It has a structure, it has a ruling group, and so on. But it's moving toward having a failed economy. And unfortunately, the international community is treating that as a humanitarian emergency. But it goes way beyond a humanitarian emergency, because the very institutions that enable a market to function in Afghanistan are now withering away. And it's much more. And Afghanistan is much more market dependent than it was before the war. It is no longer a society. It no longer has a significant proportion of subsistence farmers. Afghanistan imports food because of the Dutch disease. The Afghan currency became so overvalued that Afghan agricultural products were too expensive compared to imports. Now, it's still dependent on importing food, also because climate change has led to a series of very serious droughts. This year, 40% of the crop was lost. But Afghanistan has no access to its $9 billion of foreign exchange assets in order to finance those imports. The banking system is collapsing. And that is not something that can be easily reversed, because the people who staff it are leaving the country. Once the banking system collapses, it will not be easy to reconstruct it. You can't just be able to inject currency into it. And of course, there's now a big effort. The effort in Washington. There is no policy toward Afghanistan now, except evacuation and humanitarian assistance in Washington. There is no person at the political level in the U.S. government who is engaged in thinking about Afghanistan and its region, which, by the way, includes Russia, China, Pakistan, and Iran. So it's fairly important in a political or strategic way. And I'm afraid I can't predict what the effects of the collapse of Afghanistan's financial institutions and of mechanisms of the market may be. It may be, the Afghans are famous bricoleurs, as you say in France, and they manage to find ways to get by, and they still have access to Pakistani rupees, which perhaps will substitute for some. But I think that the embargo and sanctions that we have on the Taliban are much more dangerous for us than they are for them. They are the instrument that will push Afghanistan. That's the thing that will push Afghanistan into a kind of chaos, which will really give an opportunity to the Islamic State, which will propel migration and so on. And we are, as usual, underestimating the role of the struggle for the basic needs of life in one of the poorest countries of the world, and overestimating the importance of the rhetoric that people use. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Rubin, thank you very much for your presentation. Any questions?